Good morning. Come on, it's not that early. Wake up. You remind me of my students at a 10 o'clock class at night when they have no energy at all, and I ask them, how's everybody's day? Okay, that's great. Nothing makes your teacher feel better when you're just totally disinterested in what they're trying to tell you. So I'm going to talk for about an hour about survey data and why survey data can be difficult to work with in Tableau. And we're going to talk about a specific type of survey data called 360 assessment data. And before I get too much into that, just kind of give a little context about where I come from and why this is important to me. But I want to ask a few questions first. How many of you, it's Vegas, right? How many of you had to go and try your luck at the casino? Right? Well, I have no luck with games like that. I managed to lose $60 in about a minute and a half. So I think set some kind of record. They even offered me a free room to come back. I'm like, I'll bet you want me to come back. Very efficient at losing my money, But I'm lucky in a lot of other ways, in the ways that to me that matter the most. And one of those was my job, where I work. I work at a company called the Center for Creative Leadership. And I know people have asked me, they've seen my name badge, and they're like, what is that? Well, the center and I actually share the same birthday. Next year, we'll both be 50 years old. And we were started by the Richardson family. How many of you have ever heard of a product called Richardson Cough and Crew Salve? I don't even have to look and see if anybody raised their hand. I know nobody's heard of that. Well, how many of you ever heard of Vicks Vapo Rub? Same thing. Okay, same thing, but it was rebranded because nobody in their right mind wanted to buy cough and crew salve. Well, Smith Richardson founded the center out of a grant because he was very curious about creativity and leadership. He had this idea that you could take two people who are actually almost exactly the same money, the same opportunities, the same education, put them in similar situations. One would succeed, the other would fail. Why? He was curious about that. Smith's opinion was that the person who was successful could be creative. Okay, they could lead creatively. They could think outside the box and be innovative. So that's where we started our work. And as a nonprofit, we really are only concerned with our mission. Okay, that's what makes it a great place to be. That's what makes me lucky to work there. I don't work in a place that's constantly looking at the bottom line. One of our key measures that we're all very proud of that's actually on our strategic dashboard that we share with the board, it's not about money, it's about the number of lives we touch. How many people come to a program? How many people buy a book? How many people take an assessment? Okay, we're really proud of that number because we see it grow every year. And I'm not just talking about executives from Fortune 500 companies, though we do work with those quite a bit. We have an entire branch of our work that works with what we call societal advancement, underrepresented segments of the community. We actually have an office in Somalia that does nothing but work with people who come from poor backgrounds, who don't have the opportunity to go to this kind of training. Okay? That's what makes me lucky. That's what I love working there. I've been there for 22 years, wouldn't be anywhere else. It's a great place to work. I work with some brilliant people, some of the sharpest minds you'll ever choose to meet. Okay? The other thing that makes me lucky is the type of work I do. How many of you like to work with data? Yeah, I knew that would get some hands up, right? Well, you're part of the 20%. And that 20% is you're part of the 20% of the people who work with data to create information for consumers, that other 80%. So when companies say they like to be data-driven, no, they don't. They really don't, okay? They like to be information-driven because data without processing and data without context has no meaning. If you don't believe me, try giving a bunch of raw data to somebody on your management team sometime and say, here's the report you asked for. Before they ask you to clean your desk out and you leave, you'll understand why they don't like that. Okay, they want us to do it for them. My kind of disgusting analogy I use with my students is you have to chew people's food for them sometimes. Okay? Well, the nature of our work is based on self-awareness. You cannot be a better leader if you're not aware of your own strengths and your own development needs so that you can work on them and be better at what you're doing. And we get to that through behavioral observation. And that's what a 360 assessment is. Okay. So what is 360 data? Basically, it's the same set of items that are asked, but they're asked from different populations of people around you. So I would answer the questions about myself. And then my boss is going to answer that same set of questions about me based on his or her observations. My peers that I've chosen, that I think know me, they will answer those questions. The people who work for me, poor people, they'll have to answer these questions about me too. And then I can choose others, like if there are other people that know me well, like say a vendor or a client or somebody that knows me well enough to answer these questions. And what happens is we triangulate all these different responses so that we get a much clearer picture of what the person is actually like. Because as you all know from taking those really accurate tests on Facebook, the answers that you give about yourself, they're biased. Okay, they're biased. Not always the way you think, though. Okay, not always the way you think. And we'll see some examples of that when we kind of go through some of this data. But that's what a 360 is. Now, in structure, a 360 isn't all that different from a regular survey. Okay, if you work with survey data, whether it's Qualtrics, Survey Gizmo, SurveyMonkey, whatever, surveys data tends to have the same shape, right? You have one row equals one response with its own ID, and then every column is some bit of data. It could be a question, it could be metadata, it could be embedded data, it could be anything. And what that does is it tends to make survey data very wide. And the longer your survey, the wider it is. How many of you have ever tried to take survey data, just raw survey data, drop it into Qualtrics, not Qualtrics, I'm sorry, drop it into Tableau, and within 5 minutes you're frustrated because this is not working the way I wanted it to? I was ready to throw my computer through the window. Because I was trying to learn Tableau. I took the online courses and worked with the Superstore data, and that was great. I tried to put my own data in, it didn't do anything like I wanted it to do. And then I quickly figured out this was why. Okay, this was why. This shape doesn't work well. Now, 360s are even a little bit more complicated because you might have one response per row, but that response is all tied to one person. So if you look at the example I've got here, I have a rater type that says self. That's me. And then my first name and last name. And you see how the first name and last name gets repeated a couple of times. That's because that person has more than one rater. So it's more than one set of data still tied to that one person. Now, this is a very cut down example. But you could have 10, 11, 12 people rating you. And you have to tie all that data together in a way that makes sense about this one person. Okay? 360s are the worst because they're very long. You can have 200 items, okay, that get rolled up into scales that we can report on. And in that form, what you end up with is, in Tableau, in your data pane, you get lots and lots of measures and not so many dimensions. And if you know a lot about working with Tableau, you know that's the reverse of what you want. You want very few measures, lots of dimensions to cut by. And you can't really do a whole lot when you have 200 measures for every item that represent every item in your survey. So what we have to do is figure out, how do I make that data useful so that Tableau can do its thing? Okay? Because once you get it to work, you all know Tableau can do some amazing visuals, some amazing analytics with your data and make it more accessible to the people who are using it to make decisions. And that's what it's really all about, at least for me. When I make a dashboard for someone, my hope is not that they will come to me and say, that's really pretty, that's really cool. How did you do that? I love the shapes, I love the colors, and I love all that. It's great if you tell me that. Okay, that's great. What I really like is when they come to me and say, you know what, I used your dashboard, and I used what I found in it, and I made a better business decision. And I feel better informed about what I'm doing because of your dashboard. That's what motivates me to make dashboards. So I will make fairly plain looking dashboards, not because I couldn't do something fancier. It's because it works for my audience. They're used to bar graphs, tables, maybe some tree maps or pie charts to select as use as action filters. So I had to learn make my dashboards the way that my people want them to be for their consumption. All right, so what do we do? You could potentially fix this problem just in Tableau by doing what's called a pivot. Okay, so if you go to your data pane in Tableau, your data source, if you select more than one column, and I'll just do an example here, and you right-click on it, one of your choices is pivot. Now, you can only do that when you select more than one column. Okay? You can't just pivot one thing. And what that does is it flips the data in a way that changes the shape of it and makes it more useful for Tableau. For example, this is what our data looks like before we did a pivot. Again, one row, one response, 7 different questions with 7 scores. Okay? Once I pivot it, I get this. Now I've got a lot of rows just for the self-rater for Mr. Jack. Cool points if you know who that is. And I've got one column for his values, one column that's identifying what question that belongs to. So instead of having in this sample 7 measures, I have 1. And that measure has a label dimension that goes along with it. So my data now is no longer really wide, it's fairly thin. It's more machine readable, which is what Tableau wants. Well, if you can do that, I see some people wondering, why am I here? Why not just use Tableau? Some surveys, and 360s in particular, have more than one type of item. And that different type of item has a different response scale. So think about what happens. In the example that I'm using today, I have a 1 to 5 type response scale, and then I have a 0 or 1. What happens if I put those all under one column? What happens if I try to create an average, right? It's going to mess my data up. It's going to mess up my aggregations. So what I've got now is my score column. If I flip that, and you can see where questions 1 through 3 are on a 5-point scale. The other questions are on that 0, 1 Boolean scale. That's not going to work for me. Okay, that's not going to work. I know this because I tried it. And I got some really interesting results out of it that made no sense. It was fun to play with, but it didn't mean anything. So with this data pivoted this way, it's not going to be useful. It's not going to have any meaning. So we have to do something else. We have to fix this. And the way that we do that is actually really simple if you've got Tableau Data Prep. Okay. What we're going to do, it is a pivot. Okay, we are still going to pivot our data, but what we're going to do is more than one. Okay, that's the trick. With Tableau on its own, you can only pivot or unpivot one time. With Tableau Prep, you can do what's called a coordinated pivot, where we pivot multiple sets of data and then put them back together in the shape that we want. Okay, so in this previous example, we would do 2 pivots, and then we would end up with 4 columns. We'd have a measure for my 1 to 5 scale and labels that go with it, and then I'll have a measure for my 0 and 1 scale and labels that go with it. And I can name them whatever I want so that I don't get confused when I'm looking at my data in Tableau. All right, the way you do this is basically 2 steps. Okay, it sounds much more complicated than it is. The first thing you have to do is you have to split your data. You have to branch it. Okay, and then in one branch you're going to have one set of the data, and in the other branch you have the other. Once you've got that branched, you do your pivot on each branch and you put them back together with a center join. Okay, so a center join, you'll put them back together. Now to do that, there are some rules, and I want you to look at these, and these slides will be available for you after the conference is over. If I had to say they were the most important slides, these are the ones. Okay? So number 1, your original data, your raw data, every row has to have a unique identifier. Okay? It has to have one. Now, if you're working with survey data, good for you, you should have one. Okay, most surveys will give a survey response ID to every response you get. You need to keep that. I know one of our one of our habits when we're cleaning up survey data is to get rid of that stuff because it takes up room. We don't need it. You do need it for this. You have to have a branch for each data type you want to pivot. Again, in this example, I have 2. I have done this with up to 4, okay, where I've had to create 4 different types of data and then put them back together. Each branch has to include that unique identifier. Okay, so each branch has to include that because that's how we're going to put it back together at the end when we do our join. And then the last thing is if you're working with demographic data, if you have any, you don't pivot it, just leave it alone. Okay? You will leave it in with one of the other sets of data and just make sure that you name that branch in a way that you know where it is. And you'll only pivot the parts that need to be pivoted. Okay. If this sounds confusing, it was to me when I first tried to learn it, don't worry about it because we're going to go through an example. I have some data loaded. We're going to go through prep and I'll show you the steps. And then I'll show you what the output looked like before we did the pivot. And then I'll show you what the output looks like after, and we'll go through and do a few visualizations so you can see how easy it is. And then I'll kind of show you some finished product. Because it doesn't, what we want is to have information that we can share with people that they can make decisions with, right? And even though this is fairly simple data, once I've done this, if you work with Tableau and you do the right calculations, you can come up with some pretty informative stuff. Okay, so our data. The data we're working with today has 8,790 rows, 122 columns in its original shape. Okay, that includes 94 Likert scale items. You've got 16 Boolean items for selecting importance. The reason those are there, it's all well and good for us in the 360 to be able to look and get a score that says, I'm good at self-awareness. I'm good at balancing work-life balance. I'm bad at strategic decision-making. I need to know how important those things are to my boss, to other people that work for me. Because the things that are important that I'm bad at, guess what? I need to work on those. The things that are not important that I'm good at, nobody cares. Okay? So we got to have that. I've got 11 demographic items. And then I've got my unique identifier column. Now, when the time I get finished, I'm going to have 16 columns instead of 122, but I'll have 13,220,160 rows. And that does sound like a lot, but Tableau handles lots of rows really well, especially if you do a data extract. Okay? I have actually done this with live data sets where I ended up with over 4 billion rows, and it took 24 hours just to create the extract. Okay? So, rule of thumb, if you don't have to pivot, don't. Because every pivot step you add drastically increases the number of rows you're going to get as your output. That example I just gave you with 4 billion, it was 13,000, almost 14,000 rows, but I had to pivot it 4 times and ended up with 4 billion rows. I thought it was broken. So I got on with Tableau and they said, no, that's right. That's what you should expect to see. So be careful when you do this. Okay, let's take a look. So this is what the data looked like in Excel before I did anything else with it. So I've got my unique identifier key, which here is called an ESI. And I've got all my demographics. And I got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of items and my importance items in this data set. Okay. This works really well for Excel. This is human readable. It works great for Excel. It works great for tools like SPSS or R or statistical software, which is traditionally what we have always used in our jobs. And that's one reason that our data tends to be stored this way in a database, is because those are the tools that we used. Well, things are a little starting to change now, where instead of me running a report from this and creating a data set for somebody that I can give them and taking a couple of days to do it, put this into a Tableau dashboard, I give it to somebody, they can just do it on their own. So it's really much faster, more efficient. You just have to create that culture where people will do it. Now this is what the data looked like if I just took it as it was, as you just saw it, and dropped it into Tableau. I've got a handful of dimensions up here, mostly my demographic stuff, where I've got gender, I've got number of employees, organizational level, organization type, the sector. Then I go down here and look, and I've got all of these measures. One measure for every single item, one measure for all of my importance items. It's way too much for me to do anything with. Okay. So here's what happens if I reshape it. We're going to walk through the actual flow. Now I've gone ahead and loaded the data onto the first step, just so that it would speed the process along, because this can take a little bit of time. Tableau Prep can be a little slow when you first start loading data sources into it, and I don't want to hold us up. But I've dropped the data in, and if I click it, it kind of shows me here what I've got. So it's telling me I've got a field with these names. It tells me some sample values for those fields. And then over here, it's telling me what the type is. So I've got a lot of numerical fields, like almost all of them. So I want to add first, we're going to add a step. And in this step, it's called Clean 1. I don't know how many of you have used Tableau Prep. What they call step, they should just call clean, because that's what you do here. Okay. It's a way for you to inspect your data and make sure that it's correctly coded and correctly named before you take it any further. Now the nice thing is, as you'll see as we go through this flow, if you save this flow and you're playing with your data in Tableau later and you find out that something in here is wrong, you can actually go back to this step, change it, rerun the flow, and it will update your data set for you in Tableau. So it's not like you have to get it right here and then you never get a chance to go back. This is one of the great things about it, is it's very flexible. But let's take a look at the data that we have. So the first thing it's got is my unique identifier. It's just assigning those individual numbers. That's correct. Let me pull this up just a little bit. Okay. I've got my start date. I've got my demographic data here. And you can actually kind of play around with these and as almost using it as filters. So for example, if I was to click on self, you'll see that it changed all the other columns that now have little light blue bars, and those are just showing the data that is relative to the value self. So it's a way for you to kind of inspect your data with filtering before you ever use it. But what I really want to do is make sure that my data is clean, that I don't have anything in here that's not supposed to be. And one thing I noticed is right away, country, Tableau has coded as text. That's okay, but what I really want is to have a geographic role. So I'm just going to change that. I'm going to click on text, and I'm going to go here to geographic role, and we're going to call that country or region. And now it's reset that. And when it does, you can see, well, now it's starting to give me a few little errors. Okay, because Tableau doesn't recognize Korea, South as a data point in the mapping fields for Tableau. And I can fix this one of two ways. I can fix it here, or if you work with geographic data in Tableau, you can actually adjust it there. We're just going to fix it here. And all I'm going to do is just type over it. And just make it South Korea. When I do that, it's now changed it and has gotten rid of my little error message. Okay. Now, if I go through the rest of my data, it's all pretty clean, right, because it was all just numbers, but it's showing the distribution of my numbers. And one thing I can kind of tell right off, how many of you are data people, right? What can you tell looking at these scores? Very skewed, yeah. This has what's called a negative skew. All the data stacking up on the high side. Okay? That's one thing that is telling us right now. This is what's called a leniency error. Leniency error is when the average of your data on your scale is higher than the midpoint of the actual scale. What we should see, or what you would expect to see, would be more 3s, and then 2s and 4s, and then the least amount of 1s and 5s. Doesn't really work that way with this kind of data for a couple of reasons. One, people don't tend to rate themselves or others as very bad at things unless they really, really are bad at it. The other reason is you don't send people who are average or below average to expensive leadership programs. Okay, we tend to attract higher talent people, high performers, high potentials. That's who we get. So we are aware that our data is always going to be a little bit skewed. Okay. So this doesn't surprise me to see this. But once I'm happy with this, and I'm happy, this looks okay, now I've got to start breaking my data up. Sir? That's a good question. It did not change the data source. What it's changed is when we finish with this, we will save this as a flow output. So it sort of replaces our original data source as the source for our Tableau workbook. But it does not change the original data. Good question. All right, so we're going to add another step. And in this step, we're just going to add pivot. It adds it straight across. And I'm going to go back to this step, and I'm going to add pivot again. When you add the same step twice from a previous step, it automatically creates the branch for you. So you don't have to add the branch yourself. Now, I'm all about efficiency, so I'll do this as quickly and easily as I can do it. But right now, what I've got is 2 pivot steps. Nothing's been done in them yet. So we'll start with this first one, pivot 1. And I want to rename it because it needs to have a name that makes sense to me. So I'm going to call this items and demographics. And what that's just telling me is, if I was to go back and look at this, is I've kept my items, those 1 to 5 scale things, in with my demographics. All right. So now all I've got to do is 2 things. First, I want to get rid of any fields that I don't want. Since this is items and demographics, that means I'm going to get rid of my importance items. I don't want them in this pivot. So I know that those are at the end of my data source. So I'm going to go and find the last one. Click it. Kind of scroll back through a little bit until I find the first one. It's just right here. And I'm going to shift click that. And I'm just going to delete them. There we go. So now those items are gone, and the only thing that I have left are my demographic items, my individual identifier, and the items that I want to pivot. So the pivot part, I do wish that Tableau Prep would sort things a little differently than they do. It tends to do it in alphabetical order, so you have to be a little careful when you do this. I want to select all of my items, so everything that's called an item. I'm going to shift click those so I select all 94 of those. And I'm going to drag them over into this pivoted fields. And you'll see the first thing that Tableau did was it added 2 new columns for me. Pivot 1 values, pivot 1 names. And if you watch it, what it's doing is it's taking and it's restacking that data the way we looked at in that spreadsheet example. So here, pivot 1 names, see? That's all my items now. They're all in 1 column. And the values, 1 through 5, are all in 1 column. Now I can rename this to something that makes sense for me. So I would call this item scores. And we'll call this names, we'll just call it items. Okay, there we go. So that's the first step. For pivot 2, we're going to do something similar. But this time, we're going to have to get rid of more. So in this one, I want to get rid of my demographics. Now I'm keeping this ESI because remember, that's my common field for you database people. That's your primary and I'm blanking, I'm sorry. It's your foreign key and your primary key. There we go. So we need to keep those. But demographics I don't need because I kept them in the other table. So I can go through and get rid of all of those. And I can get rid of all of the items, all 94. I don't need them. So I'll find where they are, right there. So I'm going to shift click, and again, remove. So now I'm left with nothing but the importance items and my individual identifier. And I want to pivot those. So same thing, I'm only going to pivot the things that need to pivot. So the individual identifier I'm leaving alone. I'm not going to pivot it. But I've grabbed all 16 of my importance items, and I'm going to drag them over here And once again, Tableau is now restacking those and giving me 2 new columns. And if you'll notice, the other columns now are gone, right? So it's not 2 new columns. It actually deleted the other 16 columns and put them all into these 2. So we'll rename those as well. So we're going to call this importance. And then the values we'll call importance score. Okay. So I've got my 2 new pivoted sections. Now all I got to do is put them back together. Easiest way to do that, again, Tableau Prep makes things very easy. It's very intuitive. I'm going to grab pivot 1 or 2. I'm going to drag it over pivot 1, and you'll see that it pops up with 2 options. I can do a join or I can do a union. Okay, we want to do a join because we're adding columns. You know, union is where you add rows. Well, we want to add those columns. So I'm going to park it right there, and you can see where it looks, and it says ESI is the one field that's common in both. That's how I'm going to do it. I didn't even have to tell it. It just figured it out. And it knew, based on the way that data was structured, you can see it did a center join. So if you look at the actual join diagram, that center part where the 2 circles overlap, that identifies this as a center join. And now it's going through and calculating the join results. Once that's done, the last thing, you're going to click, and you're going to say, add output. When you go to add your output over here on the left, you can see where it tells you what you want to do. Do I want to save this as a file? It will tell you, you can choose where to save it, and you can choose to publish it as a data source or out to a server, or you can just save it as a Tableau workbook file. Now again, depending on how big it is, this can take some time. That 4 billion thing I did, it took 24 hours. I just let it run at work, came back the next day, and it was done. Okay, but that's it for prep. That's all you have to do. Now, is that easier than you thought maybe it was going to be? Oh, please, somebody raise your hand and say, yes, it was easier than you thought it was going to be. Good. Question, sir? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So let's say branch 7, is just one branch 7 on the primary key, or if there's like 30 branch 7s. What do you think is the best approach for joining? Do you think it would be the best, or would Tableau intuitively line them up?
To reshape it, it sounds like what you'd be reshaping on is, instead of having a separate column for every month, you would pivot those so you had one column called month that's identified by each month underneath it, and then the values in there. To rejoin it, you would probably go through this same step where you have your ESI or your identifier. It should still put them together. Now, you may not do a center join with this one because each row is duplicated with the exact same number of individual identifiers. You could do a center. You may have to do an outer join or a left or a right. Honestly, until you kind of played with it, you'd have to see which one worked best, but that's what it sounds like. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Just a question, you said unions add rows and joins add columns?
Yes. Yeah, a union adds rows. So if you want to do a union in this, you're adding more rows of the exact same columns, ideally. In a join, you're saying, I want to add new columns to my existing rows. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
What more than one or more than 2 pivots that you want to join? Do you have to do an output step after joining 2 and then bring?
You would do multiple join steps.
Okay.
So, yeah, so if I had a third pivot, I would take that third one and drag it over onto join 1, and it would create join 2. And that's where you get that monstrous repetition of rows. Yeah. I tried to do this with, I think, 16. Yeah, it broke. It was awful. So.
So how to join 94 columns of item data with, I would count like 20 columns of your binary data?
Because it's joining the columns, but it's joining them across the rows. So even though I've got 94 items, okay, so if you think about, our example, Jack has a score for himself on all 94 of those items. He has his individual key. He also has his importance items for himself that have been rotated so that they're joined on that same key. Now, those column heights where you're getting at, they will not be the same. They don't need to be. Well, this may make more sense when we look at it. But because they're not on the same scale, you wouldn't actually try to put them together in a way where it wouldn't work. I'll show you what I mean. It takes some getting used to work with this data, believe me. Yes, ma'am. Say again? I do not know. I wish I had an answer for that, but I don't know. Okay, so let's take a look. So I showed you what the data looked like before, right? So just a refresher, lots and lots of measures, relatively few dimensions. Okay, so now this is what it looks like when I've reshaped it. Got a few more dimensions there, but look at my measures. I have three new ones. I have my individual identifier key. Tableau has decided to treat as a measure because it is a number. And then I've got the classics, number of records, and measure values, but all I've got now is importance scores and item scores. That's it. So let's take a look. So here's my items. Remember, I created those. If I take and just drag this out on a sheet, okay, I get all my 94 items in a row. But now I can take my item scores and start to do things with this. So I'll take item scores. Let's just throw that on there. And we'll change that from sum to average. Okay, now I'm starting to get an idea of what my scores look like. But then I want to break this out even further. I want to put rater type on my columns. So now I've got something here that's showing, I'm going to rotate these labels a little bit, that shows my 6 different rater types, what their average score is for every item. Now imagine trying to do that with this data. You can't. You can't do it. You would have to do one item at a time. Okay, so you can't do it. Now I can do more with this. So one of the things that, as a statistician, a person who works with statistics and data, I cringe whenever I see an average score reported without a standard deviation. Okay, if you're going to report your measure of central tendency, report your measure of variance as well. So I'm going to take my scores and I'm going to drop them back over here. And then I'll take my measure names, put it back up on the columns. And then I will change this from a sum to standard deviation. And there I go. So now I have a table for every item, for every rater category, means, standard deviations. And of course you can clean this up. We would format this to be single decimal places instead of, 3 or 4. So that is a basic page that I could give to someone if they were interested in looking at item level data across all their dimensions. It's a report. And like I said earlier, if you came in a little bit later, for me, when I'm making dashboards for people, I'm trying to give it to them in a way that is accessible to them. And because of the number of items and the number of raters, the table really does work best for my audience. Is it pretty? No, not really. Do I care? No, because I want them to be able to look at this and say, wow, this one item, these people, they really struggle with this across all rater groups. Okay? So I give it to them in a way that is most easily accessible for them. Now there's other stuff that we can do to make this a little prettier for a slightly different audience. You do have sometimes audiences who only want to look at a bar graph, and they want to see something fairly simple. The importance scores work really well for that. So I'm going to take importance and drag it out here. The importance you'll see is only 16 items. That's because those 94 items that we looked at a little while ago roll up into 16 scales. So we have you rate all 94 items, and then we create those scales out of that, right? Because you can't create scales from single items. But for importance, all we really need you to do is look at those scales and decide how important are they. And it's really simple. The way we do it, we say pick 6. The 6 that are most important for success at your organization, you choose them. No particular order. That's all you got to do. And then we can count those, and we can do a simple ranking. So that's what we'll do. So I've got my importance items. I'll take my scores, drag it over there. There's my sum. And then I can change this with a simple table calc to percent of total. There we go. And then I can sort these from high to low. And I get a sense of which ones are most important across all my rater groups. And if I want, I can take rater groups and drag it up here on columns. And there we go. So what I can tell right now is that building collaborative relationships and leading employees are most important. Confronting problem employees and putting people at ease, not so important. Okay, not so important. It doesn't mean they're not important, it just means they're not most important. That in itself, again, doesn't really mean anything. So let's look at one other cut. I'm going to take my items again, drop them out. I'm going to take my item scores and put them on there, maybe. There we go. I want to make those an average again, and I want to put my rater type back out there again. And now, what I want to do is a little bit of exploratory data analysis. So I'm going to use the show me to make what I call a heat map. We'll flip that back around. And now I'm going to add some totals. And the reason I'm going to add my totals is so I can do sorting by totals. So I'm going to sort by my grand total here. So I'm going to put the lowest thing at the top. And now I'm going to play with my color a little bit to make this stand out a little bit more and go with the classic here of orange and blue diverging. Apply that, and oh, wow, okay. Now I can get a little bit better sense of what's going on with my lowest scoring items. The first thing that I can tell by looking at this, there's agreement. Okay, look at, kind of look across those items. For the most part, where things are low scored, most of the rater groups tend to agree. But there's something else that I can do with this. I've got my totals down here. I don't know if you ever try to total across columns, but you can, or sort across columns. So we're going to do that. Now when I go up and look, I've kind of shoved everything that's lowest up into this top right-hand corner. Remember I said when I started, the reason we don't just use self-ratings is because of bias. Does everybody remember when I said that? And I said, it's maybe not what you think it is. Because our intention, our first thought is we rate ourselves higher than other people do because we know ourselves better. We think we know what we're better at. That is actually profoundly untrue. In most cases, the self rates themselves lower than everybody else does. Okay? It's very rare for us to see an individual report from someone where they've rated themselves higher than everybody else. Okay? Pretty rare for us. So right away, we're starting to get some insights here. I mean, this is a big one. Imagine if you had never worked with this data before. Right away, you've got an insight that, the self rate themselves a lot lower than everybody else does. And it's their other, and believe it or not, their direct reports, the people who work for them, are the most lenient raters. You would think it would be your direct reports would be the ones hammering you, right? No, they don't. In most cases, direct reports are pretty happy. So we are harsher on ourselves, okay, than our raters are. This is the kind of thing that I like to do, is this exact sort of thing. It's create insights. And the group that I work in is actually called Insights and Impact. We're evaluators. We evaluate our work. We evaluate our products. We evaluate our programs. I get to do this all day, every day. And that's why I said, I'm lucky. I might have lost $60 in a minute and a half in the casino, but for 20 years, I've worked at this place and get to do this kind of work every day. Sir?
Do you ever cross-correlated this with a person's tenure or mobility in their job? Insights?
We have lots of that kind of work. We correlate these with a set of questions that we capture for research purposes, where they're asked of your boss. So like one of the questions is, this person is effective in their job. We correlate the response from the boss on how effective you are against your peer ratings on these items so we can figure out which items drive perceived effectiveness from your boss. And it can be odd, things that you would not think would pop to the top as drivers of effectiveness are frequently the things people say are not important. And remember when we looked at importance over here, right? We found that putting people at ease isn't something that most people see as important. But when you go and you actually look at the data, you find out that putting people at ease, making people feel comfortable at work is highly valued and something that makes you feel, or makes people look at you as more effective.
I was thinking more about mobility of promotions.
One of the items we do ask is this person is ready to be promoted. We can do the same test with that. Yeah. We also are able to look at things like gender, age, experience, your level in the organization, lots of different variables that we can play with. And that's what the last thing that kind of show you is with this data, kind of the finished product, what I made when I was actually completely done. So the first thing is I collapsed all my items into actual competency scores. So now my competencies match my importance. So it's a little easier to digest. The audience for this dashboard doesn't need to see item level data. They need to see the competency level data. Okay. Over here on the right, I got all the filters that they can play with. I got industry, I got job function, I got organizational level, ethnicity, gender, their age bracket, because we have it chunked out as age. Rather than ask their actual numerical age, we break it out so that we can work with it this way. And then at the top, I've got an N. Now, this is something that you have to be careful of when you do pivots, because I have many, many rows representing one person. You do have to create an N calculation, which is very simple. It's just a count distinct of whatever your unique identifier was. And that's what you use to base your N on. Otherwise, your N's are grossly inflated. Okay? But you can play around with this, and quickly see how useful this is for somebody rather than me having to go and build them a report. Let's take an industry. Let's look at computer software and services, Tableau, right? So we're going to look at that. I've got 558 people in this data set that took this assessment. We're going to look at top executives. I've got 16. And let's see how many of them are female. 4. So if I want to look at computer software executives who took this assessment, who are female, there it is. Took me all of about 6 seconds to run that. In the past, if somebody asked for that, I would have to clear my calendar and spend a day running this data through SPSS and then a PowerPoint presentation to say, here's your report, which would look exactly like this. But now I can put this in people's hands and they can do what they want with it. Now that's pretty much purely descriptive, but we did something else. In this example, we've done what's called proficiency. This is a little tricky to explain, but basically we took the boss ratings of what is considered minimally proficient. And then we ran a calculation to see what percentage of all the people in the data set for these filters meet that threshold for every item or for every competency, and then restricted it to the top 6 and have it sorted by rank. So For health products and services, the most important competency to that industry was building collaborative relationships. And 69% of the people that we have in that data set are minimally proficient. This gets very different as you start looking at other industries. For example, let's look at non-US government. Boom. The most important thing to them was strategic perspective, and only 46% make the cut. 46% also make the cut on taking initiative. 34% make the cut on leading employees. Remember, these are the top 6 most important things. So we can use this to figure out, as we go to work with clients in different industries, we can run this and we get a sense before we ever even meet with them where their challenges are likely to be. Because when a client comes to us, one of the things they're expecting from us is that we use our knowledge, our 50 years worth of experience, to tell them what to do. Because they don't know. If they knew, they wouldn't be coming to us. Okay. But both of these visuals, very simple to use. This was a little challenge to make, to run all the calculations for. But we can put this out in the hands of anybody who needs to use it to have access in the organization, and they can access this instantly. Because this is actually tied back to the flow, all I have to do is rerun the flow from the database periodically to update this data, and I can keep it refreshed. Okay. The days of having to go through and figure this all out a week at a time, plug and chug with SPSS, gone. We don't do that anymore. And we're starting to do more and more of this kind of work with our survey data. Survey dashboards, we're even doing dashboards at the client level. If you've got a big client, does a lot of programs with us, got a lot of responses, we can do dashboards for them and put that out in their hands. So Tableau and Tableau Prep, big game changer for us, for me especially, because I'm the one that used to do a lot of this work. So do you see how valuable Tableau Prep is if you're a person that works with survey data? How many of you now want to go home and play with your survey data with Tableau Prep and try this out? Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Yes?
Looking at your data, you showed dimension scores. How did you use table counts? How did you go from the 94 to the 16 dimensions?
I wrote calculated fields. Averages of, you have a list of all the items that go in a dimension. So this dimension equals the average of this, 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 and this.
That's always static with your assessment, isn't it?
This particular assessment is static, yes. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
This is a small question, but in your former workbook, can you show how you sorted each column once more?
Sure. So when I sorted the columns,
In the key map,
yeah.
where you press something in the total.
Yeah. Okay. So any column that has data in it, if you hover your mouse over it, you'll see it put that tiny little sort icon. Most people don't know, or at least I find most people don't know, you can actually do that with the rows. So you'll see it right there. So yeah, I just sorted it that way. And it's just a way, if I sort both, it kind of shoves the highs or lows in whatever direction I want them to be. I tend to put them in the top because, to me, the low scores are more important. I want people to focus on them first. So I sort them that way. Got it? Good. Yes, ma'am.
Any idea if they're going to update so that you can actually see your output as a data source instead of just
I don't know. I hope that they do. There's a few changes. I mean, I love Tableau Prep as it is, but there are some changes. I've sent in, you can send in feature requests. I've sent in a few. I would encourage everybody, if you've got a feature request, to do it. They're pretty responsive about it. It is still fairly new. And there's room for improvement for sure, and that's a big one. Yeah. Any other questions? The workbook? I don't see why not. It's been completely anonymized and has nothing in it that can't be there. I know that they put the slides out. I do have workbooks similar to this if you find me on Tableau Public that you're more than welcome to download and play with. I let my students use them too. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Part of teaching it is I have to do data sets the students will find interesting to play with. So it's all like sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know. I don't know if you guys ever do Monday Makeover, but there for like a week, several weeks, it was, let me see, drinking, which was actually pretty cool. And then it was how often people by age groups had sex per week over a period of however many years. And then right after that one, no joke, right after that one was the prevalence of STDs. It's like there's a pattern here, you know. But I use those because the kids find them interesting, but also they could see patterns. Like in the, I know we're diverging a little, but the one about number of times people had sex, it showed this massive increase in 2012. I mean, way higher than any other year over this 30-year period. Does anybody remember what was supposed to happen in 2012? Yeah, Mayan calendar, end of the world. I guess we were all making up for lost time. Okay. But, you know, for me, if you want to get an insights out of your dashboards. So that's what I teach my students. That's how I do them myself. I make it for the audience in a way that they will find use out of it. I don't care what it looks like. It's not about me. I had to get over, when I was first learning this, it's not about me showing off my cool data viz skills. It's about me building something that somebody can look at and understand without me having to explain it, and they can make better decisions from. Any other questions? Parting thoughts? Oh, well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Thank you.